Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy. I'm Michael Scharf, the director of the Frederick K. Cox International Law Center at Case Western Reserve University. Today, our experts will be discussing the controversial policy of targeted killing of Americans abroad. We'll also be talking about the failure of bringing to justice tyrants who are on the loose. And finally, we'll be assessing America's exit strategy from Afghanistan. We are very fortunate today to have with us from Washington, D.C., a famed international prosecutor, David Crane. David was appointed in 2002 by the Secretary General of the United Nations to be the founding prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. And just a few weeks ago, Dave got to see his courts come to fruition when they convicted former president of Liberia, Charles Taylor. Dave, thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Michael.
And so, Dave, I understand with you across the table in Washington, D.C. is Paul Williams. Paul is from the Public International Law and Policy Group. He's a professor at American University. He's been with us before, and it's great to have you back, Paul.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be here today.
Here in our studio, we have Shannon French, who is the director of the Inamori International Center for Ethics and Excellence at Case Western Reserve. She came to Cleveland a few years ago from Annapolis, where she was a professor at the Naval Academy. Good to have you here.
Great to be here, Michael.
And then our final expert is Milena Sterio, who is a professor of international law at the Cleveland Marshall College of Law.
I'm happy to be here,
Okay, there we
Michael.
go. Thank you. All right. So we're all here together, and we're ready to be talking about some really controversial issues in international law. The last time we did one of these broadcasts, we were having a spirited debate about the use of predator drones, which are these flying robots that are being used in Afghanistan and Pakistan and are killing our enemies on the battlefield. Today, we're going to be talking about something even more controversial, and that is we've just recently learned that these predator drones are now targeting Americans. Let me start with you, Dave. Dave, you were originally, for 30 years, a lawyer in the Department of Defense, in the Army. And so I think you have a really good sense of what's legal and what's not on the battlefield. The Obama administration has now acknowledged that we're basically assassinating Americans abroad, that there is a hit list of U.S. Americans involved in al-Qaeda. Doesn't that violate the international and U.S. prohibition on assassinations?
Yes, it does. And just as an aside, not only was I a lawyer during those 30 years in the federal government, but I also was a special operations officer and a senior intelligence officer. And one of my clients, when I was a judge advocate and a general counsel, were various special operations organizations that were very much on the pointed end of the spear. So I'm very much knowledgeable as to the parameters of how we can use a very precise instrument such as special operations. But to answer your question, the policy of the United States is we do not assassinate people under Executive Order 12333. We only, for military necessary purposes, target lawful military targets. And if by chance we have another target, and that is going to be taken out by other assets within our national security apparatus, then a president can issue a special finding to allow that to happen. But then again, under the National Security Act of 1947, he has to notify Congress to that effect.
So I guess that's the issue. We can't assassinate people, but we can engage them militarily. So let me ask you, Paul, when you sat back and heard the Attorney General give his speech where he was justifying the context and the situations when we can kill Americans abroad, what were his justifications? What were his parameters?
Well, Michael, there's three important parameters that emerged from Attorney General Eric Holder's presentation back a few months back. The first is it seems that the administration has found a legal basis for determining that the executive branch, quite frankly, can be the judge, jury, and executioner of American citizens abroad if they find it necessary to do so and there's an imminent threat to the United States. They also very cleverly have determined that since al-Qaeda is constantly looking to strike the United States, we are constantly under this imminent threat. So it's essentially complete discretion of the executive branch to execute American citizens when they believe it's necessary to do so. What's the second important parameter, which is interesting, is in order to get to this decision, they've blurred the distinction between constitutional protections and law of war. Earlier in the previous administration, it was a global war on terror. This administration has rejected that approach and sought to criminalize it. However, traditional constitutional law limits the ability to go after American terrorists abroad, so they've sucked back in the law of war. And in so doing, they've invoked this third element, which is it's permissible to have collateral damage. So we have a very perverted approach here where we're mixing constitutional provisions, limiting them by the laws of war, and even permitting collateral damage when we carry out an execution of American citizens abroad.
Now, Paul, you just mentioned the constitutional approach in the United States. Let me ask our law professor, if we compared this to a situation in the U.S. where a police officer shoots a suspect, what does the Constitution require in that context? And how is that different than what the Attorney General is saying we can now do abroad?
So under our Constitution, there's a famous Supreme Court case called Tennessee versus Garner, which says that a police officer can shoot a suspect only if the suspect is engaged in a dangerous felony or is armed and represents an immediate threat to the police officer.
So just because they're a member of the mob or a narcotics organization, we can't just go and kill them on the streets.
We
right?
cannot go and kill somebody on the street just because of their status or their membership in an organization. That's correct.
Okay, so now let's talk about what's going on in the field. Last September, a U.S. drone attacked in Yemen an American named Anwar al-Awlaki. He was a U.S.-born cleric. He was suspected of being involved in al-Qaeda. He was on this hit list that Paul told us about. Traveling with him was a journalist who was not on any hit list. Both of them were killed. What would the Constitution say about that?
So the Constitution would clearly not permit an assassination or shooting of someone like al-Awlaki in these circumstances. Al-Awlaki was driving in a car with a passenger in the middle of the desert. He did not represent an immediate threat. However, let me just come back to something that Paul mentioned. Under the current Obama administration approach, basically we've defined al-Qaeda as a group that can strike against us at any time with no notice. So basically we've sort of defined away the imminency requirement because we consider them to be able to strike against us at any point. We say, well, basically, any threat that they pose to us is imminent.
Okay, so al-Awlaki and his friend, the journalist, are driving on a highway in a desert, and a predator drone just blows him up. And they say that he was somehow an imminent threat while he was driving his car in the middle of the desert. And basically they're saying that because wherever he goes at any time, he's always a threat.
That's exactly right. And, you could sort of make the argument that maybe he was in the car, but maybe he was driving to an al-Qaeda training camp, or maybe he was on his way to construct a bomb that he was going to be using against the United States. But that's essentially the approach, yes.
And it wouldn't matter no matter if it was 10 hours away, this training camp, or the bomb site,
right,
or 10 minutes away.
Under the Obama administration approach, it would not matter. The imminency requirement has basically been defined away.
All right, so Mr. International Prosecutor, our military expert, let's get back to you, David. The Attorney General's answer to this conundrum is that if an American joins the enemy in a war against the United States, he becomes a legitimate military target. Fourth and Fifth Amendments no longer apply. Does this mean that only in the battlefield, only in Afghanistan, this theory works, and maybe in Yemen, or would this apply anywhere in the world where members of al-Qaeda who happen to be U.S. citizens are located?
I think it's a matter of perspective. If we have an American who joins the enemy and is actively engaged in combat operations against the United States, then he's a legitimate military target and can be engaged. As we peel away from Afghanistan and broaden this alleged threat around the world, let's say in Yemen, then it becomes more problematic to hook this individual in as a valid military target, because we have a bright red thread in international criminal law, which I prosecuted individuals in West Africa, is you don't intentionally target civilians. And so, but for certain rare or specific exceptions, such as their turn around as a levy en masse and begin to target you, you have a right to self-defense, or they become unlawful combatants taking up arms against you. So you can target them, but in this situation it becomes a very slippery slope. I am very, very concerned about, just like assassination, where we go out and execute individuals for what they may do, be they American or not. I think that that's very problematic in the wrong direction where we want to take the law and military operations.
And so currently, Dave, they're saying that not just in Afghanistan, where we actually are fighting a war, not just in Pakistan, where the war is spilling over, but places like Yemen, Somalia, where else? Where else are they using Predator drones around the world? Where else should we be concerned about this?
Well, again, Predator drones are the wave of the future. They're relatively inexpensive, very precise, which is good because you have to be precise when you use force. But I think we're reaching for them without thinking completely through their legal use and whatever ramifications. Our listeners have to understand that if the military uses a drone, they have to follow the laws of armed conflict, military necessity, proportionality, unnecessary suffering, discrimination. If other national security assets use it, those rules don't apply. And I think that's really important here for us to lay on the table because, again, we have a different set of rules depending on who's flying that Predator.
And back to Paul, when you were describing the Attorney General's justification, you mentioned that it's the CIA that's making the decision here. Is that right?
Well, I think David's hit on the key point here. Is there's been a blurring of law because there are so many characters on the U.S. government side involved in executing individuals abroad, including American citizens, and the administration has been unwilling to simply say we're in a global war on terror and the laws of war apply. They've been mixing it with constitutional provisions, and quite frankly, Michael, they've been hollowing out our constitutional protections.
All right, but
because
Paul,
they're reluctant to pursue it.
But Paul, I'm not going to let you get away with
war.
dodging the exact question. My question is this: I'm a little bit more comfortable with what Dave is describing as having a military officer control these drones maybe in a hot battlefield situation. What I'm worried about is if the CIA has control of this, and what I want you to tell me is who's got control. Should I be losing sleep over
Michael,
this, Paul?
You should be losing sleep over this because you're one of the few people asking this question. And when it has been asked to the U.S. government, they've refused to answer. There's robust oversight. It's a serious and controlled process. Trust us. We have a death list, and we're killing people without constitutional provisions.
And the CIA are doing it. So, Shannon,
yeah,
you're
I was going to say, I got to get in on this.
You have to. Now, do you agree with the proposition that the war on terrorism is worldwide and that we can be having the CIA kill not just foreigners, but Americans, maybe across the border in Mexico or Canada or anywhere else in the world?
No, absolutely not. And it was raised before, and I can't emphasize this enough, that this blurring of the lines, it absolutely undermines all of the core values that went into the principles in the first place. And for example, the just war tradition on which all military ethics is based is there precisely to try to limit the scope of war. So that when you do, as the expression was used, hollow it out and take out all of these constraints, you're making it meaningless. And you also have this problem that when they introduce a new technology like the drones, they act like, aha, it's a new technology, so we can pretend the old rules don't apply. But they do. I can't say this strongly enough. The old rules, the principles that are behind the law of armed conflict, the ethics behind it, they don't alter when you come up with a clever new way to kill people. There are still certain people you can kill certain ways and certain people you can't. And I will also just point out that having a CIA director have the power to kill U.S. citizens without due process, that is incredibly dangerous, and it's nothing that you can find justification for in any of the principles of goodness, the founders of this country. Also, I'd like to point out, no one man should have all that power. And I am quoting Kanye West when I say that.
Who wants to jump in there?
Michael, this is Paul. I'd like to jump in and agree with Shannon and take it even in a slightly different direction. What I found astounding, Shannon's pointed out that when we have a new technology, the government sort of embraces it and thinks the old rules apply. But what's astounding is that the population also embraces that. So, for instance, 60% of those who identify themselves as liberals support executing American citizens abroad without due process. But only 49% support the death penalty after trial by jury. That's astounding. Somehow, it's okay to execute American citizens by a drone without due process, but it's not okay once they've been through a trial by jury.
Well, let me ask a question here.
Go ahead, Dave.
Just real quickly. Why don't we take the al-Awlaki scenario, instead of it being Yemen, that it's on I-40 heading west, just near Asheville, and we find him doing the very same thing, and we've got a Predator drone. What happens then? Anybody?
Well, let me ask you this. Related to that, isn't it true that Congress just passed a law that allows us to have Predator drones in the United States now?
There you go.
So
it's just the beginning.
We're going to start seeing, first for surveillance, but who knows where it goes. I mean, let's say it's not just al-Awlaki. Let's say there's any kind of drug bust or organized crime or something that a Predator drone happens to see. Does it have to call in the cops, or can it just unleash a Hellfire missile as it did against al-Awlaki in Yemen?
Well, imagine this. The FBI seeking from a judge probable cause to kill because we've got al-Awlaki on I-40 heading west.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the due process angle. David, some experts are now suggesting that there should be a special court established to decide when a targeted killing should be authorized, so it's not completely in the discretion of the CIA director. What do you think of that idea?
I think it's an excellent idea. I think that we've already done it once before when we decided to electronically surveil American citizens or U.S. persons, I think, as the statute says in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act back in 1978-79. It was a compromise. The executive branch said we've got to have this capability to protect the country. Congress agreed, but they said we'll compromise and let you have that authority, but we want to have our third branch of government, the judiciary, take a look at it to make sure that the Constitution is not violated. So I think we have a precedent. I think if we're going to go down this road, then I think we're going to need to have something like this, or give the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act courts more power to review these. We actually have the system already in place.
Let me ask Milena this, though. Isn't it true that in all but one case out of thousands filed, this Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court has always approved the wiretap warrants?
Yes, Michael, that is correct. However, if you think about it, you could argue that the court here, the FISA court, does act as a barrier in a sense that only the well-written, justified applications are submitted to the court. The fact that we have a court prevents anybody from submitting a frivolous application to the court. So even though most of those requests have been approved, what about the thousands of the requests that have never been filed? And I think definitely I agree with David that some sort of a judicial oversight is necessary, because when the executive acts as prosecutor, judge, jury, executioner in secret regarding the targeting of American citizens, that's a very scary thought.
Well, and there's a difference
in DOD,
between sorry. I was just going to say there's a difference between wiretapping and killing someone.
Absolutely.
So, I would like to think that if there is what you're describing, a bit of a pause before even submitting a request for some wiretapping, there would be an even greater one before saying, review this for permission to kill.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good point to bring up, is that I don't know the exact statistics. I used to write those and move those around for the Department of Defense in a particular issue. But the Attorney General of the United States has to personally certify to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court that there is probable cause to surveil a U.S. person. So the standard is so rigorous, and the process is so reviewed by general counsels and judge advocates before it even goes to the Attorney General. The point was well made here just now, and I think it's important for your listeners to understand, is that they don't all actually go to the court because there is not enough probable cause. So I think that it would work. It's better than nothing.
And yet, is there any proponents of this? Is anybody suggesting this on either side of the aisle?
Well, we are.
I had
right
a very
now.
bright student. I just had a very bright student write about it in one of my papers, which I just graded, and it was simplistic but yet perfect. And but no, I don't. You hear it in the academy and among practitioners over cocktails, but in reality, I personally know of nothing being formalized either at the legislative level or being kicked around at DOD or at Justice.
And Mike, this is Paul. This is what's very sort of shocking, is there is a weak accountability debate. When the war on terror was launched and and the drones were initially used, there was a fierce debate in the public, in the media, about whether we should be doing this. That debate no longer exists. For some reason, as Shannon mentioned earlier, it's new, flashy technology. It's been embraced by the government. That's fine. But it's also been embraced by the general public and by the self-proclaimed watchdogs that are supposed to constantly challenge this type of activity. But there's deafening silence from the human rights community, from the civil libertarians. It's quite frankly, Michael, it's stunning.
All right, so while we ponder the specter of these stunning robotic killing machines flying over our streets in the United States and abroad, let's take a short break. And when we return, we'll be discussing the challenges of bringing some of the world's most wanted tyrants to justice. Welcome back to Talking Foreign Policy, brought to you by Case Western Reserve University and WCPN 90.3 Idea Stream. I'm Michael Scharf, and I'm joined in studio with Shannon French, the director of the Inamori Center, and Milena Sterio, an international law professor from Cleveland State. From our NPR affiliate in Washington, D.C., we have David Crane, the former chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and Paul Williams, the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group. So we've been having a really entertaining discussion that went way too long, but couldn't stop it, discussing the legality and pros and cons of targeted killings of Americans abroad. In our second segment today, we're going to be talking about the failed efforts to bring some notable tyrants to trial. And David, I want to start with you. I mean, it's really amazing that we have you on this show, especially with this topic. A few weeks ago, you were sitting in the courtroom when former leader of Liberia, Charles Taylor, was convicted by the Special Court for Sierra Leone. Dave, as the founding chief prosecutor of that tribunal, you were responsible for the indictment of Taylor back in 2003, and I understand that that was somewhat controversial. What was your thinking at the time?
Well, my thinking at the time was that as I walked Sierra Leone and visited other parts of West Africa, I told the people of West Africa that no one is above the law, and the rule of law is more powerful than the rule of the gun. And I told them, don't believe what I say, believe what I do. And so when I decided to unseal the indictment of Charles Taylor, which I signed on the 3rd of March of 2003 and unsealed it in June of 2003, my intent was to show the people of Africa that no one is above the law. So I wanted to bring down intentionally Charles Taylor before the world and let people know that the rule of law is more powerful than the rule of the gun.
And would you say that that was the signal that was sent 2 weeks ago?
I think it was. And I'm, again, this isn't about anybody but the people of Sierra Leone, and I think that they now believe that the rule of law is more powerful than the rule of the gun.
But it sort of is about other populations as well, because isn't it true that people like AlBashir, the indicted leader of Sudan, are sort of looking over their shoulder and are sleeping a little bit less comfortably now?
Oh, indeed. But again, at the end of the day, modern international criminal law, the bright red thread throughout all of this is politics. We have the ability to prosecute. We have the rules, procedure, the jurisprudence. It's going to be a political decision to hand over any head of state, whether it be Charles Taylor, Mladic, Milosevic, and Omar al-Bashir. So someday, someone is going to make the political decision to hand him over to the International Criminal Court.
Now, Shannon, you taught for years and years at the Naval Academy. When you think about international prosecutions of these leaders, I'm sure many people argue that it's important for deterrence, to deter future war crimes. But is there any empirical data? Is there any evidence that there is any kind of deterrence from this?
I hate to say this, but the answer is no. Now, there may come to be some level of deterrence. Maybe it's a cumulative effect, and the more that there's regularity and you get a consistency of certain punishments coming down for these tyrants, maybe there might come to be one. But the trouble is you're dealing with people who are already risking their lives in the sense of they're obviously not making fans in the places where they're doing their war crimes, and they risk getting killed if they lose power.
And there must be something about being a tyrant where their cost-benefit analysis is not
it's
the
a little
same
skewed,
as an
right?
ordinary person.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, you're already dealing with people who are off the rails. So is the fact that, hey, you might be hauled in front of the Hague really going to stop someone who already thinks it's okay to do the things they're doing?
But if someone like AlBashir of the Sudan, who's been indicted now for 5 years, can continue to thumb their nose at international justice, doesn't that send sort of an opposite signal? Doesn't it sort of say you can get away with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more important from the justice perspective than from the deterrence perspective. I mean, in the sense that what it says to the victims, what it says to the people who are judging the international community's resolve on questions like this, that's where it matters. But I'm not convinced that anybody who is about to commit genocide goes, oh, wait, I might get hauled in front of international court.
Now, speaking of AlBashir, let me bring Paul Williams into this conversation. Paul, you were a peace negotiator between the Sudan and Southern Sudan. You were an arbitrator in the ABA arbitration between those two countries. You know the situation in the Sudan. Tell us about AlBashir. What was he accused of? Why is it important to bring him to justice?
Well, what's so stunning about the continued existence of President AlBashir in power as the president of Sudan is that, as you say, over 5 years ago, he was indicted by the International Tribunal for Genocide in Darfur. That hasn't stopped a whole host of international envoys going to his door and trying to negotiate peace with him, both in Darfur and now with the conflict in a place called Southern Kordofan and Blue Nile. As David had mentioned, the rule of law is more powerful than the gun, but it's not entirely clear that the rule of law is more powerful than the political predisposition to accommodate and appease those individuals. Shannon mentioned it might not change their mind, but quite frankly, it certainly should change the mind of the international community trying to negotiate peace deals or bring about peace. There's this delusion that you can dance with the devil and not get burnt. And I think that's a lesson that we have to start taking seriously and learning when dealing with individuals indicted for war crimes.
Now, Milena, Paul just mentioned that people are going to the Sudan. I guess they want al-Bashir's oil, so you have diplomats going there. But he's not just hanging out in the Sudan. He's hopscotching all around Africa, and nobody's arresting him. Don't they have an international law obligation to arrest him and send him to The Hague?
Sure. So al-Bashir certainly is not traveling to places like France, England, and Italy, but he has been traveling around the African continent. Now, other African states have been claiming that al-Bashir has what's called a head of state immunity, which is an important principle and rule of international law. So the question here is whether the fact that there's an outstanding warrant by the International Criminal Court, does that trump the principle of head of state immunity? There's a lot of argument to be said that yes, it does, especially in this kind of a situation where the International Criminal Court is actually investigating in Sudan because the situation was referred to the court by the UN Security Council. So that arguably trumps any idea of state or head of state immunity. However, African countries say basically they're going to go to the International Court of Justice and ask for advisory opinion before they decide what they're going to do.
And David, let me turn back to you. I know you've been doing work on this issue. The countries of Africa are kind of losing their excitement about the International Criminal Court. They're becoming disenchanted, and part of the reason is the situation involving their fellow head of state, al-Bashir. What do you make of all that?
Well, again, I think it's wrong to say that the ICC is focusing on Africa, but I think that Africa is symptomatic of an attitude that is starting to permeate the court, and that is a bit of arrogance. From their perspective, they believe that they are the permanent international court that deals with these things, and I think they've lost sight of the fact that they're a court of last resort and that this should great deference to the opinions and perspectives of any country, a states party, as to how they would like to deal with the situation. And I think that is a critical thing for us to consider because I think they've lost that perspective.
Well, speaking of a court of last resort, another situation involving the International Criminal Court is Libya. They have indicted Muammar Gaddafi's son, Saif Gaddafi, and Libya says, no, we want to prosecute him. So, Dave, why can't Libya prosecute them? Or Paul, what is your take on that?
Well, Michael, let me pick up on that because I think this is an important. We're learning a very important lesson from Libya, which answers the question you asked earlier about the African Union and head of state immunity. The people of Libya are hugely in favor of accountability and justice, and that's why they want to see Saif Gaddafi, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, prosecuted. And they want to see him prosecuted in Libya because that's where he committed his crimes and because it's important as part of the healing process. And what we learn from here is the people of Africa are quite keen on justice. You hear a lot about the African Union, not being interested in the ICC work or justice in Africa anymore, them being unfairly targeted. As Milena points out, they pick, oddly enough, head of state immunity because they're worried about themselves. Mike, a recent poll showed that 77% of Kenyans support justice mechanisms. 71% of Nigerians support these justice mechanisms, and about 90 to 95% of the Libyans support these. So the people of Africa are very much behind this idea of accountability. It's just that the leadership isn't quite so enthusiastic about that.
And Shannon, I'm going to let you have the last word on this.
Well, I was just going to say that justice requires consistency, and we, the U.S., but also the international community, have been accused of inconsistency in places like where we intervene and where we fail to do so. If there's also inconsistency in terms of, who we haul before the court and who we still try to make deals with, we're just reinforcing the idea that it isn't justice for all. So I think that's a significant thing.
All right, it's time for another break. When we come back, our experts are going to provide a critique of America's exit strategy from Afghanistan. Stay with us. We're back with Talking Foreign Policy. This is Michael Scharf, the director of the Cox International Law Center at Case Western Reserve University. With me in studio still are military ethicist Shannon French and international law professor Milena Sterio. From our Washington, D.C. affiliate, we have International Prosecutor David Crane and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, an NGO that does peace negotiations throughout the world, Paul Williams. So we've been debating the policy of targeted killings of Americans abroad. We had a brief discussion of what to do about bringing tyrants to justice. And in our final segment, we're going to spend some time talking about America's newly penned exit strategy from Afghanistan. David, I want to start with you. You spent 30 years in the military. To date, 1,900 American troops have died in the war in Afghanistan. There have even been 423 casualties from Ohio, where we're broadcasting from today. As a former special ops officer, a paratrooper, and a senior executive in the DoD for 30 years, can you tell us why the United States has over 100,000 combat troops in Afghanistan? What are we doing there?
Well, I think that we're there to, in fact, stabilize Afghanistan. We've already defeated al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We have a challenge in Pakistan as well. But the combat troops that are there are necessary for us to achieve our military objectives as we transition from a military operation to counterinsurgency and then to essentially building a new country called Afghanistan. None of this happens in sequence, A plus B plus C. There's blending and steps forward. It's one step forward, two steps back at times. So you need the stability of combat troops not only to take on whatever threat it may be, but also to ensure that they don't attack anew until it is time for us to hand over sovereignty, or not sovereignty, but certainly the ability for the Afghan army and the Afghan police to keep Afghanistan stable.
All right, so 10 years ago, when we determined that the Afghan government of the Taliban was partly responsible, together with al-Qaeda, for 9/11, we attacked. We toppled the Taliban. They went into hiding. We've been there. You say we're doing some nation building. We're trying to do counterinsurgency. Are we winning? What are the measures of success here, Dave?
In these situations, I have to tell you honestly, I don't think we are winning. There's no such thing as winning in situations like this. I started my public service career during the Vietnam era in a very interesting war. It's going to be up to the Afghan people as to what they want to do, regardless of how hard we work to do it. And I'm certainly not belittling the sacrifice of American citizens, wherever they may be, and that's not what I'm saying. All I'm just saying is we have to be very, very careful in our objectives in these what I call dirty little wars, and I think we've been there just a bit too long. It's faded, and at this point in time, we're not, quote, winning the war, because, again, we don't know what that is, but the Afghan people will eventually in the next couple of years.
So, Shannon, David says maybe we're not winning, but if you read newspaper accounts, the administration says we're doing just fine. We're making progress. what are the metrics that they're using?
Well, I mean, you have heard them use some metrics that worry people because they're reminiscent of the Vietnam War. We just heard the reference to that, in that they're talking about body counts. However, there is a difference, and I think it's an important difference, in that when they do talk about having killed specific people, it is named people within the al-Qaeda organization or, in some cases, Taliban leaders. It isn't this really disturbing account that happened in the Vietnam War, where they were simply tallying up numbers of dead on the other side, and in some cases even blurring the line between whether they were civilian dead or combatant dead. So I think it's unfair to make that correlation quite that strong. And I would also point out, from a just war tradition perspective, that the war in Afghanistan has a much stronger ground for our reason to be there in the first place than, say, Iraq did. But it's now, all this time has gone by. Do we still have a reason to be there? Are there better ways that we could do this moving forward?
All right, so we should be maybe suspicious of the metrics that we hear the administration using. At the same time, a few months ago, the people there were outraged when U.S. soldiers burned copies of the Quran at a NATO base. Then a couple of months ago, a U.S. officer went berserk. He went door to door on a shooting spree, and he killed 16 civilians, including 9 children. Mm-hmm. There have been countless cases in the news where our Predator drones from our first segment have killed a lot of innocent civilians that are collateral damage or maybe in mistaken airstrikes. So are we losing the effort to win the hearts and minds in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, I think that's one of those yes and no kind of questions, because on the one hand, you're absolutely right, and a lot of this has led to what they're calling green on blue violence, meaning that some of the folks we're trying to train and are partnering with in Afghanistan, some of the Afghan troops are actually attacking U.S. troops. So obviously that's disturbing. It doesn't suggest that we're winning over the people in the country. But at the same time, though, there isn't the urge to push us out immediately, at least in the kind of dramatic drawdown that some folks would like to see, like us literally pulling everyone out immediately, because there's still a reliance and there's an understanding that if we left immediately, that people are not trained to replace the U.S. troops.
Well, the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, certainly wants us to stay there, but let's talk about him for a minute. So he's seen as corrupt. He's unpopular.
That's
seen
because
as
he is corrupt,
unreliable. He's seen as contemptuous of the United States.
Although
Echoes
some of that
Vietnam,
is playing
right?
to, well, I mean, some of the contemptuousness of the U.S., I mean, he's playing to his domestic audience there, and he has to, particularly when these horrible things happen. I mean, we have had these atrocities on our side, and so, of course, he can't turn around and say, yeah, I love the U.S.
But
after
we've
these happen.
hitched our horse to his wagon, right?
Well, there's no other horse. I mean,
and what are the implications of that if we're taking our destiny and linking it with his?
Well, I do think it's worrisome. I'm not going to belittle that. But at the same time, I think everyone understands that there is no other horse and that we're not linked so much to him as we're trying desperately to find some kind of stability and leadership. And if a new leader came along that we had more confidence in, I don't think anyone expects that we would not ditch Karzai for this new, better prospect.
Now, Paul, you've been in almost every war zone around the world, but I don't think you've been to Afghanistan yet. Is that right?
No, and not anytime soon.
Okay, so let's get you there in spirit anyway. With Osama bin Laden dead and the Taliban ousted, is it still in America's vital interest to fight on in Afghanistan? Why not just pull out now?
Actually, Michael, you've hit on this. We have a very serious problem with our policy in Afghanistan, and that's that we're delusional. We've lost this war, and we're unwilling to admit it. And thereby we're creating policies and commitments for the next decade that are going to tie us to this sinking stone. The military has done its job. They hunted down Osama bin Laden and they shot him dead. They've pushed the Taliban out of the most important areas. They've cleared and they've held territory. And then they turn around and they say, okay, we've cleared and we've held territory. Let's get the Afghan government here, the Afghan security forces. As Shannon pointed out, there's just as much likelihood as green on blue violence as there is in actually holding territory from the Afghan forces side. Politically, we have massively let down the people of Afghanistan and our military folks who've been in there fighting the battle. There was a recent interview on NPR where a senior American official was asked the question, well, what happens when all of this international aid that's currently going into the country as part of the war effort pulls out? Won't the bubble collapse? And no kidding, he said, no, it won't, because most of the money has been taken out as legitimate profits by international contractors, or it's been brought out in suitcases of cash to points beyond Afghanistan. So the Afghans won't actually notice when the economic bubble supported by the war effort disappears. What kind of policy, what kind of strategy is that?
David, you used to teach at the Judge Advocate General School. You're a student of military history. Perhaps you have a different take on this. If we rapidly pulled out of Afghanistan, what would be the risks?
We're stuck to a tar, baby. We are in it for the rest of it, and we have to deal with it. I agree with my colleagues. We've got issues. We can't pull out. This has not been thought through completely. I agree with Paul. We accomplished the military mission, and now we just can't pull out because it would be catastrophic. It would be a weakened Pakistan, because really what we're really talking about here is Afghanistan/Pakistan, or as they say over there in that part of the world, AFPAC. And that's how they are approaching it now, because you have to. So if we just pull out, there will be a sucking chest wound, there will be a black hole, and then we'll start this all over again, because then, nature abhors a vacuum, and someone's going to step in. So we're in this, and we're going to have to quote Richard Nixon as we pulled out of Vietnam, we need peace with honor.
Well, Milena, speaking of peace with honor, the president was just in Afghanistan, somewhere that Paul won't go. And he made a deal with Karzai, a long-term strategic partnership agreement. Can you tell us what the different provisions of that agreement are?
Sure. So the president just recently traveled to Afghanistan. It was a secret trip, unannounced for security reasons. And while over there, the president signed a pact with President Karzai. That pact, basically, in the pact, the United States promises to reduce troop levels of American soldiers in Afghanistan to 68,000 from about 100,000 this fall. And then most American combat troops are supposed to depart from Afghanistan by 2014. However, with all that said, the United States has pledged to keep military advisors, trainers, riot police, etc. in Afghanistan for as long as another decade. Now, we've also said we're no longer going to have U.S. military bases. However, we will use Afghan military bases over there. So that leaves the door open for the United States to use Afghanistan for continued drone strikes on the Taliban or al-Qaeda forces in Afghanistan or possibly Pakistan. For as long as another decade, we actually will be there in somewhat reduced numbers, but we'll still be there.
All right, Paul, you've done 24 peace negotiations. Help us break this down. What are the criticisms of this agreement? What should we be worried about?
Well, the criticisms of this agreement are essentially that it's not an agreement. The obligations on the Afghan side are to fight corruption, and Shannon can tell you why that's not going to happen. And then they commit us to basically pay the salaries of the Afghan security forces. And David's right. We're stuck with this. We're swimming in a race with a stone tied around our waist. But we have to acknowledge that. We have to embrace that and then craft a policy around that. Simply funding the Afghan Defense Forces billions of dollars into the indefinite future isn't a policy. We think we're winning, we're Afghanization this approach, we're turning into the Afghans because it's been successful, we've cleared, we've held, we're not. No. We can't just pump billions of dollars into the Afghan security forces and cross our fingers. We have to realize we are stuck with a very difficult situation, and we have to be more clear-eyed and, quite frankly, more realistic about how we approach this situation, both Afghanistan and Pakistan.
The Vietnam War ended with North Vietnamese tanks crashing through the presidential palace gates. We certainly don't want to see Taliban tanks crashing through the presidential gate of Hamid Karzai's palace.
Well, let's say worst case scenario, that is what we see. Does that mean a return of al-Qaeda? Does that mean that we're going to lose the war on terror? Dave?
No, I don't think so. Again, it's going to be up to the Afghan people as to how they want to be governed, if they've ever been governed, and that's the problem. We have to look back at history. Speaking of military history, no one has ever actually turned Afghanistan into the country that we all would like to see it, because, and frankly, that's not what the Afghan people want anyway.
Can I just say, Michael, if Alexander the Great couldn't conquer a place, probably no one can.
Is there any possibility then, Shannon, that we can see a deal with the Taliban? If they're not the same as Al-Qaeda, can they be rehabilitated? Can we join with them for the good of the country?
Possibly temporarily if our interests align. I mean, I think that's as cautious as I want to put it. But yeah, I mean, I think it is important to make a distinction between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda because it's a question of a huge difference between domestic concerns and a larger international strategy.
Milena.
On the other hand, aligning ourselves with a regime like the Taliban basically goes counter all of the human rights obligations and principles that we believe in as a country. So
yeah, it would have to go along with that.
Those,
and is that realistic? I mean, would they ever
Exactly.
agree to human rights the points enough to make us comfortable working with them? Of course, we work with other countries.
And are they the same Taliban they were 10 years ago?
Who knows if they're the same people? Probably some of them are still the same. But the problem, as Dave pointed out earlier, is Afghanistan has basically been a war zone for a long time. Before that, the Soviets were in for 10 years. Before that, it was pretty much civil war and chaos. So nobody really knows, who's aligned with whom. And the other thing is there's no unity in Afghanistan. There are all these huge tribal areas where the different tribes just, govern themselves. And so it's extremely difficult to say who we can align ourselves with or what we can do there.
Yeah, I mean, you can't use like Westphalian principles in
Exactly.
dealing with this tribal region.
Exactly.
Explain that to our listeners.
Well, it's just the idea that we're treating it like a nation state, like a unified sovereign power, and it isn't. It is a
That's
series of
correct.
tribes in many cases that have, more bond with people over what we see as borders than otherwise.
All right, but if, Vietnam, when we left there, that took a big toll on America, on its foreign policy, long term, on its interests around the world. If we are seen as losing and abandoning Afghanistan, what are the implications worldwide? Dave?
Well, I don't think again, I agree with Paul. If we're just honest with the American people and the world, here's where we stand, and here's our plan of where we're going, it's not a defeat. It is a political circumstance that we must face, and we must make the best of it. We don't have to pull away from that part of the world. We just need to make sure that we work with partners in the area to at least keep that particular group of clans stable enough that we don't see the Al-Qaeda come back in or what have you. Frankly, I don't think Al-Qaeda is going to stick around that area. They're moving south west towards Yemen and Somalia, and I think that's our next major area that we need to be concerned about is Yemen. I think that Al-Qaeda has realized that this just isn't going to happen there. They don't need to be there, and nor do we.
Well, Paul, let me ask you this. You've been talking about polls all day, so I find this an interesting question for you. In 2009, opinion polls in the U.S. showed that 56% of the American people felt the Afghan war was worth fighting. Now we've had polls in the last couple of months that have shown that the number of Americans who support the war has sunk to only 35%. Is this going to be a major campaign issue in the presidential election? Do people care about
Michael.
the outcome of this?
Yeah, I think of course this is going to be a major campaign issue, and in fact, because it's a campaign issue, it is going to contribute to our delusional approach to Afghanistan. The president doubled down on Afghanistan. It was at a point in time when he first came in that he could have picked a different path. For whatever reasons, he doubled down and decided to fight this war, and now he's lost this war. But he can't say that, so he's going to have to pretend he's won it. And of course, Mitt Romney is going to make the argument that the president doubled down and lost the war and now can't find a clear-eyed way to deal with it. And I think what the Americans are realizing a little bit quicker than some of our government officials is that we're not stuck in the Cold War. You don't lay out a map and then color code all of the countries blue or red, us or them. It's much, much more complicated than that. Afghanistan 4 years from now is going to be a hybrid with territories controlled by the Taliban, other territories within Afghanistan controlled by other groups. It's going to be highly complicated, and we should be thinking about how we manage our relationship with that intensely complicated and volatile country, not pretending we're going to pump billions of dollars to the National Guard and hope it stays in the blue category and doesn't go to the red category.
Well,
success is a regional approach. No, excuse me. I'm just saying we should look at the area regionally, look at the Indian Ocean as a lake with a whole bunch of partners around it, and look at it that way, and Afghanistan is a small part of it. versus focusing all our energy just on Afghanistan. Excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Shannon, once again, the last word on this.
Well, I'm just going to say I don't think it's going to be a major campaign issue, and that's because domestically the trouble is people lost interest after bin Laden was killed. And that's a problem for many other reasons, but I don't think it is going to be a major campaign issue. I think the focus is going to be on the economy and that some of these subtleties are going to be lost.
Well, I don't want to bet on the air, but I think I would bet against you if I were. Today, we've been looking at 3 very thought-provoking issues ripped right from the headlines. CIA assassinations of Americans using Predator drones, indicted tyrants that are still on the loose, and now Americans' Afghan exit strategy. We hope that our conversation has shed some light where before there was only heated debate. If you want to weigh in on this discussion or suggest a topic for an upcoming broadcast, please send an email to talkingforeignpolicy@case.edu. That's talkingforeignpolicy, all one word, @case.edu. Thank you again to our panel of experts, former International Prosecutor David Crane, President of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Paul Williams, both in Washington, D.C., and also our experts in studio, Director of Case Western's Inamori Center, Shannon French, and Cleveland State Law Professor Milena Sterio. I'm Michael Scharf, Director of Case Western Reserve's Cox International Law Center. Talking Foreign Policy has been brought to you by Case Western Reserve University in partnership with WCPN 90.3 IdeaStream.